I never played the Final Fantasy games as a kid. I was the prime age for it, but the only consoles I had growing up were a Game Boy Advance, a PC that could run Minesweeper, and a friend with a Nintendo 64. I was aware of the series from articles and magazines and from seeing physical copies on shelves in stores like GameStop, but it seemed mysterious and complicated. By the time I was old enough to appreciate the series, it was already well into the double digits, and it was one of those things where I told myself, well, when I have time and money as a grown-up, I'll play all those games and see what the big deal is. Well, now I am a grown-up with appreciably more money than I had as a middle schooler, but significantly less time. Funny how that works. About a year ago, in June of 2023, the 16th mainline Final Fantasy game hit consoles, and it happened to release on a console that I owned. So I decided to give it a try. Less out of any sort of franchise loyalty, and more because the combat looked like a mix of Devil May Cry, Nier, and God Hand, a few of my favorites. And I was intrigued at the dark and gritty direction the game was supposed to take. I found it to be good and occasionally great. The music was phenomenal, although the promised serious and mature story took a nosedive for me around the time they started saying the phrase mother crystals. It was the very definition of a 7 out of 10 game, but one that piqued my interest in the rest of the series. And I decided the Final Fantasy VII Remake project would be a good place to go next. Final Fantasy VII holds a very special place in a lot of people's hearts. It was a generational effort by Square Enix that pushed graphical, gameplay, and storytelling limitations from the previous generation. It introduced a roster of world-famous, iconic characters, and it's often cited as one of the greatest games of all time. I have no prior connection to it. Like I mentioned before, I never played these games as a kid. I don't know who Cloud is, or what his relationship to Tifa is. I hardly know what a Moogle is, and Shinra sounds like a D-tier monster Godzilla fights in one of his less well-known movies. I guess what I'm trying to say is, this video is a bit like a lab experiment. What if you kept a guy in a vacuum-sealed room for 30 years and never showed him a Final Fantasy game? What would he think of Final Fantasy VII Remake? Well, I'm about to tell you. I don't think an opinion like mine is any more or less valuable than that of a person who loves Final Fantasy and has strong feelings about the series, but that seems to be the standpoint of a majority of reviews and retrospectives you see on the internet. I played this game as a kid, now they remade it, let's see how it stacks up. Well, if you want to know how an almost complete stranger to the series likes the game and what he thinks of it, I'm your man. I think it's best to start with a few words on video game remakes in general. A huge amount of labor power, time, and resources in the past 10 years in video game development have been devoted to remaking games that were specifically popular in the 90s and 2000s. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with remaking a video game, but it's important to outline why this has been a favored project of a whole host of studios over the last decade. When games get the high-budget remake treatment, there are a few different reasons why. These reasons are not mutually exclusive and oftentimes overlap. Partly, games may get remakes because the technology available to developers at the time of their original release was insufficient to realize their artistic vision. After all, it wasn't too long ago that game sizes were measured in megabytes and there was a hard limit on the number of colors you could display on a screen at any given time. Remakes give artists a chance to really show the player what was previously relegated to the realm of their imagination. We can't ignore what is probably the main reason that some projects get greenlit for remakes and others do not, though, and that is money. Video game studios are businesses, some of them publicly owned and traded. They have a duty to maximize profits for shareholders, pay employees, and increase their revenue year over year. Why exactly is Final Fantasy VII getting a remake? Well, the people who played it and loved it in 1997 are now in their 30s and 40s, and have the disposable income and the warm, fuzzy nostalgia that motivates them to drop $70, $80, even $100 on a special edition remake. After all, it's easier to sell a known quantity than a brand new IP. Like I said before, I don't think remakes are bad, but as a trend in video game development, I think it points to a certain stagnation, at least in major studios, as well as an implicit criticism of older games. A remake implies that the existence of an older game is not good enough. Everything has to be modernized, from UIs to combat systems to narratives and music. Oftentimes, remakes are marketed as the definitive edition of a game, the real experience the developers wanted you to have, unencumbered by technological restraints. But games are historical artifacts, made by particular people at a particular point in time. and the constant drive to modernize threatens to, if not completely erase, at least overshadow these older games as pieces of history. I'm not saying we're going to lose the original Final Fantasy VII anytime soon. It is well preserved across numerous platforms, available in all its 1990s glory for anyone to play. But what about games that are less well known than Final Fantasy VII? What happens when so much labor power and capital is invested in remaking the past to the detriment of preserving it the way that it was? Gaming is already facing an archival crisis, with hundreds if not thousands of titles now almost completely unplayable with no digitization efforts on the horizon. Games, tangible pieces of history, are being lost to time. The only ones that survive are the ones with strong enough collective nostalgia to justify a line item in a budget at Sony or Nintendo. So where does this leave us when it comes to Final Fantasy VII? I'm afraid I'm a little at a loss to really tie up this section neatly. From what I've read, the story of Final Fantasy VII Remake is a significant departure from the original in some ways, and that in and of itself is an interesting meta-commentary on remakes and the desire to change or even erase the past. But I'll leave it by saying that my feelings on remakes are mixed in general, but my impression of Final Fantasy VII was largely positive. In 1993, the town of Oak Creek, Wisconsin, suffered one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in American history. 4 members of a radical environmentalist group targeted the city's nuclear reactor, one of the few operational reactors in the United States at the time, with homemade explosives. The quartet planned on slipping in unnoticed but were caught entering the property. What followed was an hours-long standoff that eventually erupted into a confrontation between the activists and local law enforcement, state police, and even the National Guard. Over 100 people were injured or killed in the attack, and the plant was damaged beyond saving, depriving the people of Oak Creek not only of power for their homes and businesses, but their jobs as well. The plant had employed almost 60% of the city's working-age population. Except none of that ever happened. What I just described is actually the opening hour of Final Fantasy VII Remake, a game about terrorism where you play as the terrorists. You might think this is hyperbole, but everything you do in the first act of this game could get you thrown into Guantanamo Bay if the setting were transposed onto modern geopolitics. It's hard to decide what's more striking: the game's explicit endorsement of direct violent action against corporate control and state power, or the fact that it got me on its side so quickly. I didn't think about the broader implications of the Shinra bombing until well after, because I was having so much fun with it. When the original Final Fantasy VII released in 1997, the world had not yet experienced the mania of the War on Terror that it would after September 11th, 2001, but it was not a world that was unfamiliar with terrorism. Both the homegrown variety and that of a more foreign vintage were known quantities in the United States. Timothy McVeigh bombed the Alfred P. Murrah Building in Oklahoma City in 1995, that act itself a response to what he perceived as the mishandling by federal agents of the Waco siege in 1993. That very same year, Al-Qaeda operatives detonated a bomb in the parking garage of the World Trade Center, a sort of prelude to 9/11. The idea of terrorism, that is, an act designed to demoralize a population through violence that typically targets civilian or civilian infrastructure, was not yet the lodestone of American life and politics it would become, but we knew it when we saw it. It is then a little surprising that one of the best-selling and most successful games of 1997, only 2 years after Oklahoma City and 5 years after Waco and the World Trade Center bombing, would so prominently feature as its main cast of characters a group of eco-terrorists. Of course, Wedge, Biggs, Jesse, Barrett, and Tifa wouldn't call themselves terrorists. That's one of the defining features of the term. It is a label others give to you to describe you, typically over and against how you would describe your own motivations and desires. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, as the saying goes. Avalanche, and by extension our main character Cloud Strife, would describe themselves as a resistance movement using legitimate means to fight back against overwhelming power. Avalanche has a lot in common with real-world climate action groups like Sea Shepherd Conservation Society and Extinction Rebellion. But most of the time in our world, the actions of groups like this are met with, at best, sighs and eye rolls, even though most people would admit that the logic behind their actions is sound. Our planet has limited resources. The extraction of those resources and profiteering from them worsens inequality and in the long run damages the ability of our planet to sustain human life. These are not radical claims, but because to address them would mean addressing fundamental contradictions in how our world functions, they're often met with derision, mockery, or are simply hand-waved away as the naive, bleeding heart concerns of the young and idealistic. The narrative magic in Final Fantasy VII Remake lies in its ability to construct a world very much like our own, with similar incentives, power structures, contradictions, and class conflicts, but make us root for radical, even violent resistance against the status quo. A status quo that most of us very much have a vested interest in. I have a house, and a job, and a 401k, and if a bunch of spiky-haired miscreants blew up a power plant in my hometown, I'd be pissed at them. But I love Avalanche, and Barrett, and Tifa, and Jesse, and Wedge, and Cloud, and I feel a swell of pride when I watch them plant homemade explosives and fight law enforcement officers. I want them to win. So how does Final Fantasy VII pull off this magic trick? There are, of course, 1,000 different ways a story can get you to root for characters who have goals and interests diametrically opposed to your own. Final Fantasy VII's world is very much like our own, but not quite. They have cars and TVs, and some characters wear suits and ties and ride commuter trains to their office jobs. There is wealth inequality and police violence and environmental crises just like we have in our own world, but it's different enough that it creates some distance between you, the person, and you, the player. It's also a world that is lacking in detail in a few crucial ways. When Cloud swings a 200-pound hunk of iron into the spinal column of a Shinra cop, there's no blood or broken bones or screams of pain and terror. The quote-unquote revolutionary violence of Final Fantasy VII is stylized and gamified. No Russian this ain't. For all its heavy themes, there is a breezy, effortless air to much of Final Fantasy VII Remake. It's fun. There is also a definite sense of confidence to Final Fantasy VII Remake, which extends, of course, to the characters. This is very much creative writing 101 here, but a story sinks or swims on its characters. You can have the most interesting setting in the world, the most complex and innovative magic system, the most intense inciting incident to kick the story off, but if the actual people who populate the story are duds, the entire thing falls apart. I was worried at first that this would be the case for Final Fantasy VII. The only other Final Fantasy game I'd played was 16, and for how much praise that game received for its narrative, I never really connected to the main cast. I didn't find myself caring that much about what happened to them. I even started skipping cutscenes near the end of the game to get back to the combat, which was the thing I liked most about it. My worries turned out to be unfounded. When you seek out advice for any sort of creative writing, a common refrain you hear is that characters have to be likable. If your characters aren't likable, your audience won't, well, like them. They'll DNF the book, they'll turn off the TV show, they'll walk away from the video game. I don't really agree with this. Some of my favorite books, TV shows, movies, and games have downright unlikable bastards as their protagonists. I love a good shitheel, good-for-nothing main character with little to no redeeming qualities. Likability is overrated. That being said, I really like the cast of Final Fantasy VII Remake. Everything from the voice acting to the character models to the different ways they handle in combat comes together in a classic example of an ensemble cast that isn't bogged down by any of the moodiness or aspirations of mature adult storytelling of Final Fantasy XVI. A lot of this comes down to simplicity. We're not dealing with Tolstoy here. Final Fantasy VII goes the extra mile occasionally to show you some hidden depths of character, but for the most part, the characters are archetypal. You can graft yourself onto them and see aspects of your own life easily in their character arcs. The central journey of the protagonist, Cloud, is immediately recognizable too. It's the stuff of classic storytelling. A wounded, disconnected man works to overcome his alienation and find love. Not just romantic love, although that is a part of the story, but love as in an experience of connection to the world outside of his own traumatic experiences. I don't want to oversell it. This is, after all, a game where you play as a spiky-haired man with a sword the size of a Toyota Corolla, but you get the point. Final Fantasy VII's story is simple, classic, full of characters who directly contribute to the central themes at each turn. It's checking every creative writing 101 box, which is more rare than you might think when it comes to video game storytelling. Even some of the side characters are more developed than I expected. Jessie, a member of Avalanche who you meet early on, gets almost an entire mission devoted to her. She's a suburban kid, the daughter of a Shinra scientist, the very picture of privilege. She lives in a nice house topside with 2 loving parents and had a promising career in the arts, but her father is sick, an unfortunate side effect of working in labs with poor labor protections. No OSHA in Midgar, I guess. The sequence where you explore her house to steal her dad's ID card is a slow-paced, semi-stealth section, but the real star is her mother. You can hear her talking with her daughter and her friends in the house while you sneak through it, urging them to eat more, to come home more, to visit her more often. You know, suburban mom stuff. Not many games bother to ask questions like, how does a privileged young person with everything to lose get involved in a violent revolutionary group? More surprising, the answer Final Fantasy VII gives is pretty spot on. People who benefit from the status quo only seek to change it when the contradictions and sharp edges of the system start to hit close to home. If not for her father getting sick from his work, Jessie probably would have carried on with a normal, quote-unquote, life. But she was radicalized in a way that feels immediately recognizable. This casts all of her actions from before we discover this in a different light. She is caught up in two worlds, with opposing loyalties in each. Tifa gets several moments like this as well. Near the end of Final Fantasy VII Remake, there's a scene with her, Cloud, and Barret riding up an elevator in the Shinra building on their way to rescue Aerith. A man in a suit, distracted on a phone call with his mother, enters the elevator, rides up a few floors, and then exits without noticing them. Tifa then remarks, "A lot of normal people work for Shinra. People with families and jobs." And yeah, that's kind of how this whole thing works. Any endeavor as complex as extraction of resources or the administration of a state, by definition, needs a lot of people running the show. It's never just one or two bad people at the top making decisions. It's a whole cadre in the middle strata doing boring desk jobs. It's bureaucracy. And most bureaucrats are pretty normal, nice people. They get up in the morning, they go to work for their families, for their retirement funds, so they can save up vacation hours and spend times with the ones they love. They are dependent and have been made dependent on the status quo for safety, security, and the safe transition of property and wealth from them to their children. And that wouldn't be a problem if it weren't for the inherent contradictions, oppression, and eventual instability of the status quo. This moment stuck out to me as a little touch that added quite a bit of depth to her character. She is a revolutionary, a terrorist to some, a person who feels deeply the inequality of life and wants to change that for the people she cares about. But when she sees the normal, quote-unquote, face of the world system that has pushed her down all her life, she hesitates. The man in the suit on the phone with his mother has class interests directly opposed to hers, but he is still a human being. Contrast this with Barrett's response to her, a sermon, essentially, chastising her for her empathy. It's little interactions like this that kept me hooked on the characters. Like I said earlier, they are not particularly deep or complex, but they are well written and consistent. And for a fun action fantasy story that wears its heart on its sleeve, it puts in more character work than most of its peers. The setting of Final Fantasy VII helps the story achieve its goals as well. Ditching medieval fantasy was the best decision they could have made for this entry in the series. A basically modern setting with TVs, cars, network news channels, commuter trains, and cops with guns is a far better environment for a story of alienation and reconnection than, say, a medieval kingdom. Medieval-inspired fantasy can be great, but too often there's a strange imbalance between setting and character. Lots of medieval fantasy is populated by people who would not be out of place in a modern setting. They have modern problems and sensibilities, which in turn makes the medieval setting feel like a cardboard set in a school play, having none of the distinctive rough edges that real medieval society had. As someone who reads and watches and plays a lot of stuff in this genre, it was honestly refreshing to see Final Fantasy VII go, no, forget that. It's Earth. It's 2022 Earth. There's no Duke of whatever. It's a CEO. It's cops. If you gave Aerith an iPhone, she'd know how it works and she'd immediately start shitposting on Twitter. In fact, all of the major characters would probably have their own very distinctive online presence if given the chance. Aerith would be posting pictures of Godzilla photoshopped into Thomas Kincaid paintings. Tifa would be a Russiagate Wine Mom Mueller investigation lib poster. Cloud wouldn't post much, but he would like a lot of really angsty poetry. And Barret would fall for a crypto scam and get his account hacked by guys with Bored Ape Yacht Club profile pictures. All of this to say, I liked Final Fantasy VII's story and characters a lot more than I thought I would at first. It excels at a style of breezy adventure storytelling that feels almost more akin to Star Wars or Indiana Jones than the bloated mythical mess that these games certainly have a reputation for being. That said, by the end of Final Fantasy VII Remake, I could see the screws coming loose. For 90% of the game, the story and characters felt quite grounded and limited in scope. It's a revenge story with big set pieces and clear stakes, but there are some elements around the edges, especially in the final act, that suggest Final Fantasy VII may head in a direction I'm not particularly a fan of. I'll leave it by saying this. Not every game needs to end with you ascending to heaven for a fist fight with God. Final Fantasy VII is at its best when the action is grounded, the characters are human, and the stakes relatable. Final Fantasy VII is a much more linear game than I expected as well, with far less side content than I anticipated. This was a gripe of mine in Final Fantasy XVI. Lots and lots of side quests, my screen constantly filling with notifications and requests to go on missions for people I didn't know very well, which very rarely rewarded me with anything worth the trouble. The hunts were fun, but the sheer amount of crafting materials I earned from them never really added up to much. It felt like the game was padded out to an absurd length just for the hell of it, without a gameplay loop that really kept me invested. Final Fantasy VII, by contrast, is a machine fine-tuned to deliver set pieces in all caps. It gives you some side quests, but in small doses as opposed to Final Fantasy XVI's hamster wheel of death, where it felt like there was no end in sight. You finish a major story beat, make it to a new area, and 6 to 7 optional side quest markers show up on your map to pursue at your leisure. Most of these are quick, easy, and don't give too much in the way of rewards, but the lack of meaningful rewards felt better here than in 16, mainly due to the game's lighter tone. In Final Fantasy XVI, people would run up to you breathless, tears in their eyes, crying, begging for someone, anyone, to help them in their desperate hour of need. The stakes were ratcheted up so high that it just became tiresome. Your brother pissed off a griffin and got carried off to its nest? Sounds like his problem, not mine. Final Fantasy VII instead focuses on giving you story-driven side content that doesn't take too much of your time, and sets up some nice character-building moments as well if you want to spend more time getting to know the main cast. The main show, as I said before, is the set pieces. The escape from Reactor 7, the motorcycle fight against Roche, infiltrating Corneo's palace, ascending all the way from Sector 7 up to the top of the plate in the final act of the game. Final Fantasy VII is gleefully, bombastically on its bullshit when giving you scripted, tightly controlled gameplay sequences. There are parts of this game that felt more in the spirit of the Uncharted series than a game that carries the legacy of grindy 100+ hour RPGs in its wake. Take that ascent up the wall in Chapter 15, for instance, one of my favorite sequences in the game. The previous chapter is one of those sections where you're given a number of optional side quests to complete, only this time the game lets you know that if you don't complete these before you finish the chapter, you can't come back. You're reaching the end of the game, and you better prepare yourself for the final act. After receiving grappling guns from Corneo's right-hand man, you launch yourself up and over into the rubble of your former home, and are treated to sunset views of the devastation as you climb through leaning buildings pursued by Shinra forces. In sequences like this, you are not making many choices at all as a player outside of combat decisions, but that restriction of choice in Final Fantasy VII is always deployed strategically and for the sake of emotional and story beats. The game is fond of strapping you into a roller coaster, but it's also confident in its choice of when to unbuckle the restraints and let you stretch your legs a little. This is one of its best qualities. I'm frankly getting a little sick of games that mask their lack of storytelling ability with slick marketing terms like player agency and responsive open worlds. Most of the time what that means is the story is simply lackluster, or the writers aren't confident, and if you're bored they can say it's the player's fault. Linearity and restriction of freedom should be practiced by developers if it serves their goals. In a sense, Chapter 15 is the real emotional climax of Final Fantasy VII Remake, even though the game still contains several more conclusion chapters after the fact. It's not only visually and technically impressive, it's a great narrative choice to have the characters return to their devastated former home as a sort of trial by fire before they exact their revenge and save Aerith. What better reminder of why you're fighting than the sight of miles upon miles of burned out buildings, rubble-strewn streets, and crumbling homes? With all that destruction laid out before you, it's hard not to feel at least partly responsible as well. You didn't pull the trigger, but your actions throughout the game directly led to this disaster. It really gives you something to fight for in those final hours of the game. It's a shame then that Final Fantasy VII doesn't end on this note. There's a perfect opportunity for it, but it just can't help itself in the end and awkwardly half sticks a landing on a woo-woo supernatural note with a series of boss encounters one after another that range from excellent to some of the worst in the entire game. It throws out the grounded, heartfelt tragedy of seeing the devastation caused by Shinra and your desperate last-ditch effort to save your friend in favor of something half-baked and not nearly as impactful. This is an issue with fantasy games in general, I've found. The worlds they construct, while beautiful to get lost in, are sometimes so alien to our own world that it's really hard to connect with the characters' struggles. The Duke of Whateversville banished you from your home village, and evil spirits from beyond the veil are tormenting the realm, yada yada yada. I don't have evil spirits in my realm. We would simply tell them to leave. Final Fantasy VII comes so close to making all the right narrative moves to really hook me emotionally and get me invested in the conflict, but at the end of the day, it makes choices in those final minutes that just don't sit right with me. Why are we fighting a giant purple god thing in the sky? What does this have to do with any of the conflicts we just spent the last 35 hours resolving? I know this is the first game in a series and they're setting up sequels, but individual entries in a series of games, books, or films should still be able to stand on their own as individual works with solid storytelling fundamentals and strong resolutions. There are other, less clunky ways to indicate the direction in which your story is heading and leave breadcrumbs for the player to keep them invested. Final Fantasy VII is still a game, however much I'm comparing it to films and books and however much it draws from those other mediums, so how does it actually feel to play? The short answer is great. The long answer is, well, this next section of the video that I'm having a hard time figuring out a segue for. Final Fantasy VII's battle system is fantastic, one of my favorite systems in any modern RPG, so it's a shame that they barely let you use it at all. The act of building up ATB, spending it strategically, and leveling up materia so each character synchronizes with all the others is an absolute joy. So it was frustrating that the game kept ripping companions out of my hands just as I was getting them to a point where I felt good using them. I understand from a narrative perspective why characters come and go, so I'm willing to overlook it, but at the end of the day, it felt like a slog having to switch out equipment and materia on the fly because my dedicated healer or support tank character had to run to the gas station to buy cigarettes. I was at least looking forward to using my entire team for the 2 final boss battles, but nope, the game splits you up once again. This is less frustrating in the battle against Sephiroth because the reintroduction of your teammates to help as the battle gets progressively deadlier is a genuine hell yeah moment, but my complaint still stands. Stop sending my party off on side quests without me. I like them. Some of them I like very, very much. Let me hang out with them. Final Fantasy XVI represented a big departure from the series in a number of ways. Or at least that's what I've been told, because again, I've only played 16 and 7 Remake. And a little of 14, but 14 is weird and different and sort of doesn't count, even though we love it, and it's great. Final Fantasy XVI's combat especially got a lot of attention for leaning into a character action style of combat reminiscent of Devil May Cry or even the Nier games. I enjoyed that for what it was worth, but it suffered from balance issues in the long run. There are just some abilities that are objectively stronger and more useful than others, leading to an endgame where I was spamming the same rotation no matter what foe I was facing because it worked on pretty much everything with no need to switch it up. I tried other setups, but in the end they weren't worth the trouble. I'd always go back to what had been proven to work. I'm sure there are niche ways in which you can really customize and break Final Fantasy XVI and maximize your damage output to godlike levels, but I never felt motivated enough to tinker around with it. Unlike Final Fantasy XVI, in the end game of Final Fantasy VII, I found myself genuinely stumped by a few encounters and had to take my entire team back to the drawing board to maximize their strengths and mitigate their weaknesses. It actively punished me for assuming every encounter would be the same and rewarded me for trying out something new, which I feel like shouldn't be a rare experience in RPGs, but it is. How many RPGs can you think of that just sort of throw up their hands in the final act and say, all right, you got the best weapon, you got the best spell, go spam it at a big dragon until it dies. Roll credits. Weapon and spell choice doesn't matter nearly so much in Final Fantasy VII as skill selection, tactical thinking, and understanding the unique role each member of your party thrives in. In Final Fantasy XVI, enemies with special resistances or unique mechanics were mainly relegated to optional side content, whereas almost every fight in Final Fantasy XVI felt like it was adding a new layer of depth to the combat. I hardly ever felt like I was fighting the same enemies over and over again, and ignoring enemy differences was a one-way ticket to a party wipe and a game over screen. One of the things that sets Final Fantasy VII's combat apart from Final Fantasy XVI is pretty simple. There's a warm-up system instead of a cooldown system. In Final Fantasy XVI, you use an ability and then you have to wait for it to recharge before you can use it again. The cooldown is always the same no matter what you do. In Final Fantasy VII, you build up your ATB gauge by attacking, blocking, or parrying, or you can stack ATB at the beginning of a battle with certain items and materia. There are skills you can use to make the gauge fill faster. How frequently you use your abilities is dependent on how active you are in battle and how mindful you are of how you build your characters, which is a much more engaging system than a simple timer on abilities. It also requires you to be more strategic in the heat of battle because item use is tied to the ATB gauge. This is a decision that I hated at first, being much more used to healing in games like the Souls series, where you can heal at any time so long as you have a window to do so. But the more I played of Final Fantasy VII, the more I came to see this as a genuinely brilliant piece of encounter design. Taking away the ability to instantly recover from bad choices forces the player to consider their options in the moment. Each use of an ATB charge is a conscious choice to do damage, buff yourself, heal yourself, or stack defensive bonuses, but choosing one usually means you're missing out on all the others. Encounters can quickly snowball into a disaster if you make too many mistakes, leading to dramatic, drawn-out sequences where you limp around the arena, waiting for a chance to use a Phoenix Down or an Elixir. But they can also snowball in the other direction just as easily. You can stack damage, break enemy stance, and overpower foes if you take a minute to assess your surroundings and play carefully. Some of this has to do with the fact that for the majority of Final Fantasy VII, you have at least one other party member in the fight with you, and sometimes, but not nearly enough in my opinion, up to 3 other teammates who you can either take direct control of or have them set to a specific computer-controlled playstyle. I found myself directly controlling my party as much as I could throughout the game, even though this was typically the more time-consuming option, because I kept unearthing new depths of just how well my teammates' abilities and materia could synergize with each other. This was part of my frustration with how often the game splits you up as a party. I wanted more time to try things out and dial in combos, inputs, and buffs, but I also understand that the devs sort of painted themselves into a corner. You can become so powerful if you use your team correctly that many fights can be over practically before they start. A dedicated player could, if given the right tools, simply mow through the game on the hardest setting, and that sort of wrecks the intended difficulty curve. I am interested to see how they resolve this issue in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, though, a game which I've seen adds even more members to your roster of possible teammates. This is a battle system with a huge amount of potential that left me feeling like I'd barely scratched the surface on what I could do. I want to end on potentially a downer note. In May of 2024, Square Enix president Takashi Kiryu said in a financial results briefing that, quote, "We released multiple new titles, including major titles such as Final Fantasy XVI and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, but profits unfortunately did not meet our expectations." Shortly after that, in the same year, Square Enix offices in Europe laid off a number of employees. Layoffs, declining profits, and an extremely competitive labor market have been a factor in games development ever since its inception, but particularly in the past 5 years, programmers, developers, and studios have begun to feel the squeeze more than ever. And I think it's important to ask, what is the cost of nostalgia? These games are produced under the assumption that most people will buy them to recapture that warm, fuzzy childhood feeling of being lost in a game. Financial numbers for games are notoriously hard to come by, but this latest wave of HD remakes of games can sometimes cost into the hundreds of millions of dollars and employ small armies of people, only for those people's hard work to result in nothing more than a guy in a suit in a boardroom striking their name off a whiteboard because profits went down that quarter. The games industry is caught in a spiral of spending increasing amounts of money on developing games that appeal to nostalgia, only for those games to quote-unquote underperform. And when a game doesn't sell, it's never the people at the top who get shit-canned. It's always the people at the bottom. I really liked the Final Fantasy VII Remake, but I couldn't stop thinking the whole time I was playing, what else could this budget have been used for? We already have Final Fantasy VII. It came out in 1997, and you can buy it on any platform you can think of. This game had an estimated budget of $140 million. How many incredible, forward-thinking, innovative games could we have gotten for that money instead? I'd rather see 10 smaller games get made with that money than look backwards forever at the games I played as a kid. Time doesn't move in that direction, and our past will always be there for us to revisit if we want. Nostalgia can also be a bit of a sinister force. All it takes is for some charismatic leader to get up in front of a camera and start saying things like, "Wasn't it all better 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago? Didn't you feel safer then?" If you keep your eyes on the past, you miss opportunities in the present. And I know this is a bit of a dramatic ending for a review of a game that prominently features as a main character a guy with machine guns for hands, but I think it's important for me to be clear about this. I don't think we need to remake the past. Thank you for watching.